February 20th, 1944. RAF Debden, Essex, England. At 0708 hours, with a low winter sun breaking through thin cloud over southeastern England, the first North American P-51B Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group rolled onto the pierced steel planking runway at Debden. Frost still clung to the grass beyond the dispersal pens. Ground crews stepped back as the Packard-built Merlin engines reached full power, their sound sharper and higher than the radial engines most bomber crews were used to hearing. The men climbing into those cockpits were not new to the war, but the aircraft beneath them was. Only months earlier, few in the 8th Air Force believed a single-engine fighter could escort heavy bombers deep into Germany and still have the fuel to fight. The idea had been tried before and failed. Fighters turned back, bombers went on alone, losses mounted, entire crews vanished in minutes. This morning, the Mustangs were not turning back. The mission was part of a 5-day offensive that would later be known as Operation Argument, though among the crews assembling in briefing huts, it was already called Big Week. The objective was clear and brutally specific: destroy the German aircraft industry and force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle it could not afford to lose. The bombers would hit factories, airframe plants, and engine works across central Germany. The fighters would do something no escort force had yet accomplished: stay with them. For months, bomber crews had joked darkly about escort protection. They had flown to Bremen, Kiel, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg with fighters that peeled away at the German border, waving goodbye as fuel gauges dropped. After that came the contrails of enemy interceptors, head-on attacks, and burning fortresses falling through cloud. Some crews had stopped expecting to come back at all. The P-51 was supposed to change that. Many doubted it would. The Mustang had not been designed for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Its origins were British, its early versions underpowered and unimpressive. Only after the Merlin engine replaced the Allison did the aircraft become something else entirely. With external drop tanks, it could fly farther than any fighter in the American inventory. It could cruise efficiently at altitude, fight at speed, and still have the range to follow bombers all the way to targets like Leipzig and back. On paper, it solved a problem that had plagued the daylight bombing campaign since 1942. In practice, it had yet to prove itself. At Debden, the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group knew what was at stake. They had flown Spitfires earlier in the war and had a reputation for aggression, but they had also seen bomber formations shredded beyond escort range. The briefing that morning was direct. The bombers would not be abandoned. There would be no arbitrary turnback lines. Fuel would be managed in the air. Combat would be taken to the enemy. The Mustangs lifted off in sequence, climbing eastward, then turning south to form up over the English coast. Above them, the sky filled with the deliberate geometry of the 8th Air Force, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses assembling into combat boxes, their aluminum skins reflecting pale light. Each bomber carried 10 men, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and the expectation that fighters would finally be there when the Germans came. The crossing over the Channel was uneventful. It always was. The real test began after the Dutch coast slipped beneath the wings and the bomber stream pressed inland. At altitude, temperatures fell well below freezing. Oxygen masks went on. Engines settled into cruise. The Mustangs took stations slightly above and ahead of the bombers, scanning the thin air for movement. German radar stations had already detected the inbound formations. By mid-morning, fighter control centers across the Reich were scrambling interceptors. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed hard to altitude, climbing through contrails left by the bombers themselves. This was the moment that in previous missions, escorts would have turned for home. They did not. The first contacts came east of the Rhine. Small groups of German fighters approached cautiously, probing for weakness. They expected the escorts to be thin, limited, and short-legged. Instead, they found Mustangs waiting. The P-51s did not stay welded to bomber wings. That had been the mistake of earlier escort doctrine. Instead, they pushed outward, meeting the interceptors before they could organize head-on attacks. When German fighters tried to climb above the bomber stream, Mustangs were already there. When they attempted to dive through the formation, Mustangs followed. The air combat was fast and largely unseen by the bomber crews below. To men inside the fortresses, it registered only as distant flashes, brief spirals of smoke, and the rare but welcome sight of an enemy fighter breaking away before firing. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not choose when and where to attack. Fuel became the constant calculation. Drop tanks were jettisoned over Germany itself, a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers past Frankfurt, past Kassel, deeper than any escort force had gone before. Pilots leaned mixtures, adjusted propellers, and watched gauges with the same intensity they watched the sky. At the targets, flak took over. The bombers held formation through black bursts that rocked the aircraft and tore holes through wings and fuselages. The Mustangs circled above, powerless against anti-aircraft guns, but ready for the fighters that followed the bombers out. On the return leg, German attacks intensified. Now the interceptors came in desperation, knowing fuel and daylight were running out. Again and again, Mustangs broke them up. Some German pilots pressed attacks anyway and paid for it. Others disengaged early, unwilling to chase bombers protected all the way home. By the time the formations crossed back over the Dutch coast, something had changed. Bombers that would once have been missing were still there. Damaged aircraft stayed in formation longer, supported by fighters that could cover them until the sea appeared beneath their wings. When the fortresses began landing in England that afternoon, ground crews noticed it immediately. Losses were not gone. War did not work that way, but they were sharply reduced. Crews climbed down exhausted, some wounded, many shaken, but alive. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Escort fighters stayed. Bombers came back. The Luftwaffe lost aircraft, and more importantly, experienced pilots it could not replace. The balance in the air over Europe began to tilt, not in a single dramatic moment, but through accumulated missions like this one. The P-51 had done what its skeptics said no fighter could do. It had gone the distance. And the laughter stopped. The change was not immediately visible on a single map or in a single communique. It emerged in maintenance hangars, in debriefing rooms, and in the slow recalculation of expectations on both sides of the war. February 21, 1944, RAF Debden. The weather had shifted overnight. Low cloud moved in from the west, flattening the sky and threatening to compress the bomber formations before they ever reached the coast. Missions were adjusted, targets reassigned, timings tightened. The offensive could not pause. German aircraft production was still functioning, and the Luftwaffe still had strength enough to contest the air if given time to recover. For the pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, sleep came in fragments. Combat fatigue was not a diagnosis yet, but it was already a reality. They returned to briefing rooms knowing that the second day would be harder than the first. The Germans had now seen the Mustangs. Surprise was gone. Resistance would increase. This day's targets lay farther east. The Mustangs launched again in disciplined sequence, engines straining under full fuel loads and drop tanks. The weight was noticeable during climb, the aircraft slower to respond, less forgiving if mishandled. Pilots compensated with care rather than aggression, knowing the fight would come later when fuel burned off and the sky filled with enemy aircraft. Over the North Sea, bomber formations assembled in weather that tested formation discipline. Clouds obscured visual references. Radio chatter was clipped and formal. Any collision at this stage could abort an entire mission. The Mustangs orbited patiently, maintaining position while the heavy bombers locked into their boxes. Once inland, German fighter response came sooner than the day before. This time, the interceptors arrived in larger formations, coordinated by ground control and directed toward the bomber stream with precision. Bf-109s climbed from forward airfields, conserving fuel until the last possible moment. FW-190s approached at high speed, built for exactly this kind of interception. The Mustangs met them head-on. Air combat did not resemble the sweeping duels imagined in peacetime training. It was brief, violent, and often confusing. A pilot might fire a burst and never see the result. Wingmen were lost in cloud and found again seconds later. Decisions were made instinctively, whether to pursue, to disengage, or to break off and return to the bombers. The escort doctrine that emerged during these days was not rigid. It evolved in the air. Pilots learned when to press an attack and when to hold position. They learned that destroying enemy fighters was not the only measure of success. Disruption mattered. Delay mattered. Forcing an interceptor to abort an attack or miss a firing pass could save a bomber crew without a single confirmed victory. German pilots, for their part, found themselves under pressure they had not experienced before. They could no longer line up at altitude, execute textbook head-on attacks, and disengage at will. The Mustangs followed them down, fought them at altitude, and, most dangerously, waited for them near their home airfields. This last development was especially damaging. Luftwaffe pilots had relied on the sanctuary of base proximity. Now, Mustangs hovered near those airfields, catching fighters low on fuel, low on speed, and often alone. Losses mounted quietly, recorded in unit logs rather than dramatic announcements. For the bomber crews, the difference was measurable. Aircraft that took damage over target were no longer automatically lost. Escorts stayed with stragglers. Mustangs formed protective circles around wounded fortresses, discouraging lone attackers. Crews who had once expected to ditch in the North Sea found themselves crossing the coast with engines failing, but fighters still overhead. By the end of the second day, the 8th Air Force had flown deep into Germany again and returned with fewer losses than planners had once considered possible. The factories hit were damaged, but not destroyed. That would take time. The real shift was in the air. The Luftwaffe was being forced to fight on unfavorable terms. February 22 and 23 brought more of the same. Targets shifted to aircraft assembly plants at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Gotha, names that still carried weight from earlier disasters. The bomber crews knew the history. They also knew that this time the escorts would not leave. The Mustangs proved it again and again. Fuel management became an art practiced under fire. Pilots learned to lean mixtures precisely, to adjust throttle settings minute by minute, to choose when to fight and when to conserve. Some landed with gauges reading near empty, engines sputtering as wheels touched down. The margin was thin, but it existed. German resistance intensified, then began to fracture. Coordination suffered as losses accumulated. Experienced pilots were killed or grounded. Younger replacements flew into combat with less training and greater caution. The Luftwaffe still fought hard, but the balance was no longer in doubt. On February 24th, the final day of Big Week, the results were visible even before intelligence summaries were compiled. Bomber formations returned in numbers that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Aircraft stood damaged on airfields across England, but crews were alive to file reports, to eat hot food, to sleep in their bunks. The escort fighters had done what they were built to do, not in theory, but in sustained combat. The laughter that once accompanied talk of long-range escorts was gone. In its place was a quiet recalculation of air war strategy. From this point forward, daylight bombing would not be an unsupported gamble. It would be a contest the Allies intended to win. For the men who flew those early Mustang missions, the change was personal. They had not simply escorted bombers, they had altered the rhythm of the war in the air, one mission at a time, one decision at a time, across frozen skies and hostile territory. And the bombers kept coming back, alive.
What followed Big Week was not a pause, but an acceleration. March 1944, 8th Air Force Operations Room, High Wycombe. The maps on the walls were updated daily now, lines pushed farther east, targets selected with a confidence that had been absent only weeks earlier. Where planners had once drawn arcs that bent back at the limits of escort range, those arcs now ran straight across Germany. The question was no longer whether fighters could go the distance, it was how best to use them once they did. For the Mustang pilots, the shift was immediate. Escort no longer meant staying close at all times. It meant control of the airspace through which the bombers passed. The goal expanded from protection to dominance. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched one of its deepest penetrations yet, Berlin. The name alone carried weight. It was not simply a target, but a symbol, heavily defended and politically charged. Previous raids had been costly. This time, the escort plan was different. P-51s would not only accompany the bombers, they would range ahead, attack forming interceptors, and pursue retreating fighters until fuel or ammunition forced disengagement. It was a doctrine born of necessity and enabled by range. As the bomber stream crossed the German border, the Luftwaffe fighters rose in response, climbing into contrails already thick with aircraft. The Germans knew Berlin demanded a defense. Units were committed that might otherwise have been held back. The result was one of the largest air battles of the European war. For the bomber crews, the presence of escort fighters was no longer theoretical. They could see them, silver shapes cutting across the sky, contrails weaving above and below the formation. When enemy fighters appeared, they were met almost immediately. Head-on attacks still came, but fewer reached firing range. Tail-end Charlies were not left alone. Losses occurred, but they were no longer catastrophic. With the Luftwaffe lost that day was harder to replace. Pilots shot down over Germany did not return to fight again. Aircraft destroyed on or near their airfields could not be repaired overnight. The cumulative effect was quiet but relentless. From the Mustang cockpit, the war became a sequence of long flights, punctuated by short, violent encounters. Pilots learned to read the sky, where contrails thickened, where sunlight caught wings at a certain angle, where enemy fighters were likely to appear. They learned restraint as well as aggression, knowing that every unnecessary maneuver burned fuel needed later. The escort fighters were no longer an experiment. They were the backbone of daylight bombing. As March turned to April, the impact spread beyond bomber survival rates. German pilot training was shortened, fuel shortages worsened. Units once kept in reserve were committed and lost. The Luftwaffe was being forced into constant battle, exactly as Allied planners intended. For the bomber crews, the psychological shift was profound. They still faced flak, still watched aircraft fall away, still carried the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed, but they no longer felt abandoned once they crossed the coast. The presence of escort fighters changed how they flew, how they held formation, how long they stayed together. They trusted the sky in a way they had not before. By the time preparations began for the invasion of France, air superiority was no longer an aspiration, it was a condition. The Mustangs, once doubted and quietly ridiculed, were now a constant presence over Europe, their range and persistence reshaping every operation that followed. They had not won the air war alone, no single aircraft ever did, but they had removed the one advantage the Luftwaffe had relied upon, the ability to wait, to choose, and to strike bombers without consequence. From that point on, the bombers came back alive more often than not, and when they did not, it was no longer because they had been left to face the enemy alone. The laughter that once greeted the idea of long-range escort had been replaced by something else entirely, acceptance and then dependence. In the calculus of the air war, the escort fighters had become indispensable, and the outcome followed, steadily and irrevocably. By May 1944, over Germany, deep in enemy airspace. By spring, the strategy and technology had matured into a rhythm.
The P-51 Mustangs, now flown by veterans who had survived Big Week, escorted massive formations of B-17s and B-24s on missions that would have seemed suicidal just months earlier. Each flight was carefully timed, each turn plotted with precision. Still, nothing could remove the uncertainty of combat. Weather, enemy tactics, and mechanical failure remained constant threats. On May 12, 1944, a formation of nearly 250 B-17s targeted aircraft production plants near Leipzig. The mission was routine only in planning. In execution, it was chaotic. Clouds broke unevenly, scattering the bombers into smaller groups. German radar had already vectored interceptors toward the expected route. From the ground, fighters climbed through sunlit layers of cloud, seeking the thin silver line of bombers. The Mustangs, flying above, were positioned to intercept. Flight leaders scanned the sky in disciplined sweeps. Spotting 20 FW-190s climbing toward the lead elements, they divided into pairs and quartets, engaging immediately. The dogfights erupted with tight spirals and diving attacks. Pilots fired controlled bursts, maneuvering for position while maintaining awareness of the bomber formations below. Inside the B-17s, gunners could see tracer lines crossing the sky, occasionally connecting with an enemy fighter. Smoke spiraled upward from engines hit or pilots ejecting over Germany. From the bomber crew's perspective, the sky remained chaotic, but the pressure eased subtly. Enemy fighters were engaged before they could reach critical range. Several Mustangs ran low on fuel halfway through the engagement. They dropped auxiliary tanks, jettisoning weight to maintain combat agility. Others coordinated to cover each other, ensuring no gaps in protection opened over the scattered bomber groups. In one small sequence, a Mustang pilot dove through clouds to engage an FW-190 attempting a head-on pass on a crippled fortress. Moments later, the bomber's tail gunner reported seeing the enemy aircraft plummet in smoke. A success, but also an illustration of how much trust the bombers now placed in their escorts. By the time the formations reached Leipzig, German anti-aircraft defenses had begun to respond, but the escort fighters remained vigilant overhead. Their presence forced many Luftwaffe pilots to attack from less advantageous angles, reducing the overall effectiveness of the defense. The bombers dropped their payloads with precision. Damage was significant, but the true victory lay in the return flight. Despite earlier losses in similar operations, nearly all aircraft crossed back into occupied Netherlands airspace intact. Damaged bombers limped home, escorted by Mustangs who refused to abandon them. Crews who had once prayed for rescue could now count on it.
May 13, 1944. Debriefing at RAF Debden. Flight leaders reviewed the mission. Logs recorded enemy aircraft destroyed, numbers damaged, and bombers returned safely. It was becoming a pattern. The longer the P-51s could stay with the bombers, the fewer losses occurred. The Luftwaffe, facing attrition, was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Bomber crews now flew with measurable confidence. They still faced flak, engine failures, and the inherent dangers of long-range missions, but the certainty of being abandoned at the German border was gone. The German pilots, meanwhile, confronted a new reality. The element of surprise in daylight interception no longer existed. By the end of May, the P-51s had established dominance over the air corridors the bombers used repeatedly. The shift was subtle to outsiders, but decisive in the operational calculus. The 8th Air Force could strike deeper, maintain formation integrity, and sustain bombing campaigns critical to the impending Normandy invasion. The cumulative effect of these missions was measurable. Luftwaffe production slowed as more pilots were killed or forced to retreat. Fewer bombers were lost to enemy fighters, and Allied planners grew confident in the concept of deep penetration daylight bombing. The Mustang, initially dismissed by skeptics, had proven its worth repeatedly. It was no longer a gamble, but a cornerstone of Allied air strategy. And so the men who had laughed, the skeptics who had doubted, and the commanders who feared failure all recognized the same truth. When a properly designed long-range escort fighter stayed with the bombers, the odds could be managed, and crews could come back alive.
The P-51's presence rewrote what daylight bombing could achieve over Germany, and the victory was as much strategic as it was tangible in saved lives. Historical conclusion. The Mustang's success in escorting bombers during Big Week and subsequent missions fundamentally shifted the air war over Europe. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force could conduct sustained daylight bombing operations with significantly lower losses, directly contributing to the destruction of German aircraft production and weakening the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich. This evolution in escort strategy set the stage for Allied air superiority, a critical factor in the success of D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. The pilots, airmen, and ground crews who participated in these missions exemplified precision, discipline, and courage under conditions that were unforgiving. Their legacy remains a testament to the impact of innovation and tenacity in warfare. The bombers came back alive, and the war in the air would never be the same.